Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's actually a very interesting day for the news because many of the stories are stories that the president and many in the cabinet are trying to avoid. And these are issues that are domestically now coming to the forefront of everybody's minds and also coming to the forefront of the international community. Well, specifically Donald Trump and many aligned with the Trump administration. Now, before we get on to the main video of today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please hit the bell icon and subscribe to the channel. This will really help me in my quest to get to 200,000 subscribers this year. So let's start off with the economy. Now, a near decade stagnant growth in South Africa has occurred, which has meant that GDP is barely keeping up with population growth in South Africa. Now, what we're actually looking at currently in South Africa is sub 2% growth. That's pretty low, so that's minus 2% growth in the country. Now, what that effectively means is that people have just got poorer. Now, you may ask the question as to why that is. Well, our population growth continues to outpace economic expansion, and that in itself is eroding per capita income. Now, South Africa's manufacturing output has fallen since COVID due to energy failures, logistical breakdowns, and policy uncertainty, which is driving deindustrialization. Now, that has meant that South Africa's share of Africa's GDP has roughly halved since the mid-1990s, and its global economic relevance continues to shrink. Now, you've got to understand that context because AGOA, specifically the AGOA agreement with the United States, is being portrayed as the single most important external support for South Africa's export economy. You've got to understand how important AGOA is. Now, renewal of AGOA remains uncertain and politically contingent upon Trump's led US administration. If Trump doesn't agree this, it's not happening. Now, we've said for some time that the loss or suspension of AGOA would directly hit automobiles, components, agriculture, metals, and manufacturing jobs. And in many parts of the country, they already are due to Trump's tariffs. Now, there are reports that the Mercedes plant in East London, not doing so well, the VW plant in Uitenhage, not doing so well, and many of South Africa's local manufacturing automobile industry, their plants, not doing well, with many of those companies suggesting that they are now looking to move their operations abroad. Now, one of the big barriers that they cite quite a lot is BEE and the lack of skilled employees. They're saying that they're being forced to employ basically quotas and not skills, but we're going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, South Africa's bargaining position, specifically with the US, is being weakened by poor diplomatic signaling and inconsistent foreign policy. And again, we're going to talk about that inconsistency in terms of foreign policy in a minute. But effectively, what we see is that in many instances, we have politicians in South Africa telling us just how important this is. They really want to work with the US. And then we have diplomats going to the US calling Trump a white supremacist and a racist and a what. This piece of legislation is incredibly important to the economy, an economy that desperately needs growth, but the politicians are just retarded, to be frank. Now, South Africa says that it's waiting for dates to resume formal talks with the US after draft reciprocal tariff frameworks were exchanged. So effectively, they're trying to negotiate getting down these tariff barriers. Now, the US has already been very clear what it would need in order to drop their tariffs. And one part of that is reciprocal drops. South Africa currently tariffs many American exports, and they need to drop those. Now, at the moment, Trump's tariffs have already repriced South African exports out of the US market. It's just too expensive for Americans to buy things from Africa, especially with the tariffs. Now, South Africa's trade officials are being forced into defensive negotiations rather than growth-orientated deals because they understand that the US holds the cards. South Africa's policy credibility just doesn't exist. We don't have the economics. And so really it's the US decision makers who are driving the policy positions in South Africa because we need the agreement. And because our diplomacy is so poor, we haven't actually really been able to negotiate anything in a strong position. Now, one of the things that Trump says that he is prioritizing is critical minerals. He's got a critical mineral strategy. Now, Trump is prioritizing bilateral deals with mining countries supplying strategic minerals. And despite being platinum rich, South Africa has limited leverage due to political risk and diplomatic hostility. And analysts are warning South Africa is not indispensable, that alternative supply chains exist. And this is something that many in the government seem to forget. You will recall Gwede Matashe said, don't need America, we'll just sell our stuff to somewhere else. I mean, where they're going to get our goods to? And the reality is South Africa itself isn't the only place they can go to. In fact, many other countries are now seeming like they may actually be a better alternative. And so this strategic miscalculation is going to cost South Africa mineral dominance. And that mineral dominance, that loss of it, means that South Africa in terms of minerals is going to become irrelevant because yet again, South African politicians are retarded. Now, where else are we seeing retardation in the government sector? Well, actually we're seeing it in relation to Iran's participation in the South African naval exercise. Now, I've been talking about that quite a bit, and I've also said my piece on it on how it does raise the possibility of a, should we call it a military dispute with civilian authorities. That means that the commander-in-chief, the President of the Republic, was ignored by the military. Now, the reason for this is that apparently the South African delegation suggested that Iran should be excluded from the exercise, but we are now being told that this was not clearly communicated to diplomats or trade negotiators, and that confusion over whether presidential instructions were properly issued or enforced is everywhere because when in doubt, just say, Angas, I don't know, I didn't know anything about it. But there is still this possibility that there is military autonomy overriding the president, and that the military is doing their own thing. They're acting in a frolic of their own. And I've said before that if they are, that itself is a recipe for a coup. Now, the incident itself has significantly worsened South Africa's standing with the US and its allies, specifically because it's Iran. And as you know, Iran is busy going and killing its own citizens by the thousands, and I would highlight by the thousands. So what exactly was the supposed breakdown in communication? Well, according to Ramaphosa's regime, they all trying to blame each other. They suggest that the breakdown in command structures was between the presidency, the defense minister, and the SANDF leadership. So at some point, the communication structures there between those three failed. My bet's on the defense minister, who is a freaking moron. In any case, weak oversight and acting appointments and institutional paralysis enabled the crisis. In other words, there's a lack of governance from our government, and I'm sure none of you are looking at that going, wow, I didn't see that happening. Now, the actual inquiry as to where the breakdown in communication itself is proving problematic because the government is actually unable to interrogate senior military leadership. And this itself is eroding democratic civilian control over the armed forces, because it would appear that the democratically elected government is being ignored by the non-elected army, the armed forces. Now, the reason that you can't interrogate senior military leadership is because whenever these issues arise, the government seems to, say that guy's old and needs to go on retirement. Or, the minister needs to, go to Davos, and that won't be around for inquiry. Like, the government hides and avoids taking any form of responsibility. And this is not one of the exceptions to that. This same thing is happening over and over again. It's just the government's way of doing things. But unfortunately, what this does mean is that from a foreign policy position, South Africa is increasingly being seen as aligned with Iran, Russia, and China, whilst remaining economically dependent on the West. We've just talked about that. Now, ideological positioning is contradicting trade, investment, and growth priorities. And so at some point, the government has to come out and come clean. What is more important, growing your economy and feeding your people, or your ideological positions? Now, when it comes to commies, it's always the ideology, and screw the people, they can all starve. And there are numerous instances where this has been the position in numerous communist countries around the world, so we will not be any different. But government departments do appear to be operating in silos, and this itself is producing conflicting national signals, with our foreign policy now carrying direct economic costs. The government really needs to get on this, and they really need to sort it out. Now, one journalist actually approached Ramaphosa and tackled him on this very topic, and Ramaphosa had this to say.
An Iranian warship participated in the Will of Peace naval exercises, and there have been growing concerns saying that they defied your authority by the participation of Iran. We've also seen the United States of America saying that South Africa cannot preach world peace and world justice while they are accompanying Iran. So following this inquiry, will you be taking action against the SANDF if they indeed defied your authority?
Wow, that sounded so poetic.
He's been practicing.
Absolutely, he's been practicing this question. No, as you correctly say, the naval exercises were led by China, and we were just the host waters. Our water basin is central to many, many countries that want to do naval exercises. So China had the responsibility to organize, to lead, and to arrange this naval exercises. So they also had the responsibility to invite various countries to come and participate. Now, what happened was that we did raise with China the issue of Iran, and said that it would be best that they should withdraw and not participate. And having done so, many engagements happened. And in the course of it all, we realized that we needed more information, and that is why we've constituted a board of inquiry that is going to look very closely into what happened, how it happened, and what steps we now need to take. But more than that, we also need to see the extent to which we ourselves, even as we are not leaders and arrangers of some of these exercises, can take proactive action about certain things, participants and all that. So it is a matter that everyone in defense and in government is seized with at the moment. We rather tend to want to do things carefully and examine every aspect of everything before just blurting out and saying whatever people want to hear on the gallery. So give us an opportunity to do precisely that.
So as you can see, what Ramaphosa says is, yeah, we'll look into it and get back to you. And it wasn't actually our fault. It was China's fault. Like, we told them and they didn't tell Iran and we did nothing. Like, it wasn't our fault. Like, yeah, blame China. This is avoidance 101 by the ANC. When in doubt, blame someone else. Now, that siding with Iran is increasingly being seen as, well, problematic, because South Africa likes to position itself, as even the interviewer mentioned, as a woke crusader, as a person who's out there for the poor, disproportionately marginalized individual who's being persecuted by the big bad state. But one notices something very important, and that is that to date, South Africa has not condemned Iran at the UN for its events, its killing of its citizens. South Africa has not condemned it. Now, this itself becomes problematic because, as you know, South Africa uses every opportunity to condemn Israel because, like, it's vogue, why not? And what you can see when it comes through to the condemnation numbers at the UN is that despite Israel's military operation being in response to an actual event, an actual invasion, they have been condemned more times than Iran, who is gunning its citizens down in the street and cutting off their heads on camera. This is being seen by everyone. But apparently Israel is the biggest threat, and Iran is like, it's fine. Now, South Africa can't constantly be putting itself in a position where it's shielding Iran and other authoritarian regimes from scrutiny. They already did this with Russia, with its conflict in Ukraine. At all of the UN hearings, South Africa abstained. And so this is reinforcing perception of selective morality in terms of South Africa's foreign policy. And it's undermining South Africa's credibility as a neutral international actor, because what it appears to be is that South Africa is not neutral. Now, I did say we would get back to BEE, and that is that BEE is now being seen as a policy failure by everybody who's not the government. BEE is widely being seen as enriching a small politically connected elite with heavy compliance costs, discouraging investment and entrepreneurship, because BEE quite often, and I'm not saying in all instances, but in the majority of instances, is around ownership redistribution or wealth redistribution and not around entrepreneurship, industrialization, and creating wealth with just a small leg up, rather than it is seen as wealth redistribution so that that wealth can be respent for the purpose of a nice house and a Lambo and some Johnny Walker Blue Label. Now, the estimated annual economic drag measures in hundreds of billions of rands, and public opinion has strongly shifted towards merit-based or non-racial economic systems. But government officials acknowledge corruption and elite capture within BEE structures, and rather than propose a policy rollback, they are proposing expanded state-managed transformation funding. So in other words, we know it's a failure, we know it's been captured, we know it's elite capture, but you know what we really need? More government control. Yes, more government control will fix BEE. I mean, this should come as a surprise to no one. And so the whole reform rhetoric is now just, well, further rent-seeking. Structural economic reform remains elusive because the ANC cannot bear the thought of seeing its state-funded funding mechanisms, in other words, its state-funded slush funds. The ANC does not want to let go of BEE, despite public opinion now being increasingly hostile to it. With the economic stagnation and the government failures that result from BEE now being a cycle to propose more BEE. We've got economic stagnation, it's due to government failure, have more BEE, have more BEE, have more economic stagnation, more diplomatic isolation because nobody wants to invest here, so jobs decrease, more government failure, have more BEE. The circular nature of the parasitical policy that is BEE just seems to be continuous. And this cannot be lost on the government, who clearly sees BEE as a self-enrichment scheme. Anyway, that's my opinions. Do let me know what you think of all the stories in the comment section below. And until next time, bye.
This is a Palestinian passport.
Hey look, I've got one of those. But oddly enough, exactly like the one you're holding, it is a British passport, not a Palestinian passport.
It was issued to my grandfather in 1947. Palestinians existed. So did Palestine.
The British mandate existed, and they did call the land of Israel Palestine in English, but if you turn your passport over, you can see the native language, Hebrew, that is called Eretz Israel. Even back then, it was known as the land of Israel. Not only that, within the passport, you can see again, Eretz Israel, 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 Eretz Israel. The reason your father walked around with a document mentioning the land of Israel 9 times isn't random. That government of Palestine explained that, like the English people call Germany, Germany, but the native name is Deutschland in German, the native name for the land of Israel is Eretz Israel. That's why that term Eretz Israel appears on any passport, driving license, stamp or coin of the British Mandate.